The IDF is celebrating nothing tonight. While Beirut lights up with fireworks and the television anchors describe the Lebanon ceasefire as a turning point, the Israeli military establishment is doing a different kind of calculation. It is counting what it has left: interceptors, radar systems, production capacity, and what it is finding when it counts is the specific answer to the question that nobody in the American press is asking directly. The question is not whether Israel will accept this ceasefire. The question is whether Israel can afford to let Iran use this ceasefire, because what a ceasefire gives Iran is something that 47 days of the most intense American-Israeli military campaign since the Gulf War failed to take away from it: time. And time in the context of what Iran is doing with its nuclear program and its missile production capacity during a ceasefire is the single most dangerous gift Israel can give to the adversary it launched this war to eliminate. Stay with me, because what I am about to walk you through is the military logic that leads inevitably to a second round, not the political logic, not the coalition survival calculation, not Netanyahu's corruption trial. The military logic, the logic that exists independent of which Israeli politician is in power, and that will drive the next phase of this conflict, regardless of what the diplomats in Islamabad and Doha produce over the next 2 weeks. Let me start with the interceptor inventory, because it is the foundational military reality that shapes everything else. Before February 28th, when Operation Epic Fury began, Israel entered this war already depleted. The June 2025 12-day conflict, Operation Rising Lion, had consumed at least 34 Arrow 3 interceptors, roughly 9 Arrow 2 interceptors, and 39 THAAD interceptors. The Arrow 3 expenditure alone exceeded $495 million in ammunition costs in 12 days. The fiscal year 2026 defense budget projected only 32 new THAAD interceptors for the entire production year. In other words, 12 days of fighting last summer consumed more than a full year of THAAD production. Israel entered this current war already running a deficit it had not replenished. Now add 47 days of sustained Iranian missile barrages, 56 named waves of Operation True Promise 4, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, attack drones, cluster munition-equipped warheads, forcing simultaneous engagement across every tier of the defensive architecture. In the first 5 days of the current conflict alone, the United States expended over 800 Patriot interceptors. That figure exceeds the total number of Patriot missiles fired across the entire duration of the Russia-Ukraine war. At approximately $3 million per interceptor, 5 days of defensive operations cost an estimated $2.4 billion. Now run that consumption rate across 47 days and ask yourself what is left. The answer is not enough. Not enough to defend against a second Iranian campaign of the same duration and intensity. Not enough to give Israeli military planners confidence that the defensive architecture can hold if Iran resumes operations at full capacity. And here is the critical military logic that transforms the interceptor inventory problem into the specific reason Israel will restart this war rather than wait. Iran is not standing still during this ceasefire. Iran is rebuilding. Iran is restocking. Iran is producing. The Shahed drone production lines that were running before February 28 are running now. The ballistic missile production facilities that survived the strikes, and most of them survived because Iran dispersed its production infrastructure precisely in anticipation of this scenario, are producing now. The Fatah II hypersonic glide vehicles that entered combat on March 1st and demonstrated that the intercept calculus against them does not work with currently fielded systems. More of them are being produced now. And the interceptors that Israel would need to defend against a second Iranian campaign are not being produced at anything close to the rate required to close the gap before the ceasefire ends and the next round begins. A single Arrow 3 costs between $2 and $3 million and takes years to produce. There's no emergency production surge that compresses that timeline. There is no budget transfer that makes interceptors appear faster than the manufacturing process allows. The $826 million Israel approved by phone in the middle of the night in March cannot buy interceptors that the production lines cannot deliver. So here's the military geometry. Every day the ceasefire holds, Iran restores production capacity that Israel strikes degraded. Every day the ceasefire holds, Iran moves closer to the operational inventory levels it had before the conflict began. Every day the ceasefire holds, Israel falls further behind on interceptor replenishment relative to the consumption rate that the next Iranian campaign will impose. The military window for Israel to achieve its objectives, specifically to degrade Iran's production capacity faster than Iran can restore it, is closing. And the Israeli military establishment knows exactly how fast it is closing because they are the ones counting the interceptors and modeling the production rates. This is not speculation. In August 2025, Yuval Bassi, the vice president of Rafael Advanced Defense Systems, said publicly that Iran's hypersonic missile development had forced Rafael and the IDF to fundamentally rethink air defense. He said the old model of launching a faster interceptor to chase an incoming warhead no longer works against the Fatah II class of weapon. The head of the company that builds Israel's interceptors said on the record that those interceptors cannot reliably stop the weapon Iran is now producing more of during the ceasefire. That assessment did not change when the ceasefire was announced tonight. The physics did not change. The intercept calculus did not change. What changed is that Iran has more time to build more of the weapons that calculus cannot defeat. Now, let me walk you through what Iran actually did to Rafael and Israel aerospace industries on March 16th, because it is directly relevant to why the military window is closing and why Israel will act before it closes completely. On March 16th, Iran struck both facilities in Wave 55 of Operation True Promise 4. Rafael builds Iron Dome. Rafael builds David Sling. Rafael builds the Iron Beam laser intercept system. Rafael builds the Spike anti-tank missile family. Rafael is the industrial nervous system of Israeli military capability. Israel Aerospace Industries builds the Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 systems. Between them, these two companies represent the entire production chain behind Israel's defensive shield and its offensive sword. Iran targeted both on the same morning with the most advanced weapons in its arsenal. The strike did not destroy either company. It damaged them. It disrupted production timelines that were already stressed by the demand of an active conflict. And it sent a message that is the most strategically important communication of this entire war. Iran knows where the factories are. Iran knows what they produce. Iran knows that those factories are the constraint on Israel's ability to sustain defensive operations over time. And Iran demonstrated that it has the weapons to reach those factories. That is not a one-time demonstration. That is a threat that persists through the ceasefire and will persist after it. Every day, those factories operate under the knowledge that Iran can strike them again. Their production efficiency is compromised by the security measures, the dispersal requirements, the workforce disruptions that come from operating a defense industrial facility that has been struck by hypersonic missiles and that knows it can be struck again. The March 16 strike was not just a military operation. It was a message about the long-term industrial competition between Iranian strike capability and Israeli defensive production capacity. And that message says, we can hit your production lines faster than you can build what comes off them. Now, let me tell you about South Pars, because the escalation sequence that Israel initiated when it struck the South Pars natural gas field on March 18th tells you something important about Israeli operational thinking that gets missed in the daily coverage of missile exchanges. South Pars is not a military target in any conventional sense. It is the world's largest natural gas field. It is the source of roughly 70% of Iran's natural gas production. Striking it was an act of deliberate economic warfare designed not to degrade Iranian military capability in any immediate sense, but to impose economic costs that compound over time, and that signal to the Iranian population that the cost of the conflict will be felt in every home, not just in military installations. Iran responded by attacking the LNG production facility in Qatar, forcing Qatar Energy to declare force majeure on all LNG shipments and pushing allied gas prices into crisis. The exchange told you something about how both sides are thinking about the long-term economic dimension of this conflict. Israel was willing to accept the regional economic disruption of the Qatar strike. in order to impose the South Par's damage on Iran. And Iran was willing to disrupt its own regional relationships to demonstrate that Israeli economic warfare produces immediate and visible regional consequences. That exchange is not resolved by a 10-day Lebanon ceasefire. The South Pars field is still damaged. The LNG disruption cascades are still working through global energy markets, and the Iranian calculation that it can impose economic costs on Israel's partners faster than Israel can impose economic costs on Iran has not been disproven by the ceasefire. If anything, the ceasefire validates it. Iran accepted a ceasefire on terms that included its own 10-point framework being used as the basis for negotiations. That is not the outcome of a side that was losing the economic warfare dimension. That is the outcome of a side that imposed sufficient economic pain to bring the other side to the negotiating table on Iranian terms. There is a dimension of this that the European capitals are watching with alarm that does not get the attention it deserves in American coverage. Germany stated plainly that as long as this war continues, there will be no participation. The UK said it will not be drawn into a wider conflict. Japan, Australia, South Korea all declined Trump's request to send warships to escort tankers. Not one allied nation has committed a single vessel. In my time working alongside allied military establishments, I can tell you that this level of collective refusal does not happen by accident. When every partner simultaneously declines to participate, what you are observing is a coordinated signal. American partners are telling Washington with the only language that actually registers in strategic terms that this war was a mistake and they are not going to pay for it. What that means for the restart scenario is specific. If Israel restarts operations against Iran in an environment where American allies have already publicly refused to participate in the current conflict, Israel restarts alone, not with American air support of the scope deployed in the first round, not with allied naval coordination that does not exist, with whatever it can generate from its own depleted inventory and whatever the United States is willing to contribute from a political position that is already stressed to its limits. That is a dramatically different operational environment than February 28th. And the IDF planners who are doing the restart calculations know it. Let me now address the IDF's internal assessment of what was and was not achieved, because the gap between the public statements and the internal assessment is where the restart logic lives. The public Israeli position is that Operation Epic Fury achieved significant degradation of Iranian military capability. The public position cites the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, the destruction of air defense infrastructure, the degradation of missile production capacity. The internal IDF assessment, which leaks in ways that intelligence establishments always leak when the gap between the official narrative and operational reality becomes too wide, tells a different story. Iran appointed a new IRGC commander within 24 hours of the first strike. A new supreme leader was named within a week. The missile campaign continued without meaningful degradation across 47 days. The Fatah-2 strikes on IDF command centers killed 12 American officers and 7 IDF officers in events that the IDF's own defensive systems could not prevent. The interception rates that were running at approximately 8% penetration in the first week of the June 2025 conflict rose to 25% by the final day of that conflict. Apply that degradation curve to 47 days of the current conflict, and the penetration rate in the final weeks of fighting was not 8%. It was moving toward a number that Israeli defensive planners look at and understand means the shield is not holding at the rate the public narrative requires. The IDF knows what it achieved, and it knows what it did not achieve. What it did not achieve is an Iranian military that is less capable of prosecuting a second campaign than it was before the first one began. That is the assessment that drives the restart logic more than any political calculation Netanyahu is making, because military establishments do not need politicians to tell them when a strategic objective has not been achieved. They can read their own operational data. And the operational data from 47 days of the most intensive conflict in Israel's history says the threat is still there. The production capacity that sustains the threat is recovering, and the defensive capacity that would have to absorb a second campaign is degraded relative to where it was when the first campaign began. Now, let me connect all of this to the specific timeline that makes the restart most likely. The current ceasefire between Iran and the United States is a 2-week arrangement that has not been formally agreed to be extended by either side as of today. The Lebanon ceasefire that just began tonight is 10 days. The diplomatic process running through Pakistan and Qatar is trying to bridge the gap between Iran's 10-point framework and American maximalist demands that include zero enrichment for 20 years. That gap is not bridgeable in 2 weeks. It may not be bridgeable in 2 months. And Israel has made clear through every public statement from every significant figure in its political landscape, from the coalition partners who demand more to the opposition leaders who demand better, that it will not accept an outcome that leaves Iran's nuclear program operational. The timeline where all of those dynamics converge is approximately the next 2 to 4 weeks. The ceasefire expires. The negotiations have not produced a comprehensive agreement. Iran's production capacity has partially recovered during the ceasefire window. Israel's interceptor deficit has not meaningfully improved because the manufacturing timelines have not compressed. And the diplomatic cover that the ceasefire provided for the American administration to describe this conflict as moving toward resolution begins to evaporate as the ceasefire itself shows signs of the collapse pattern that has characterized every previous ceasefire in this war. The 10-day Lebanon ceasefire was already being violated within hours of its announcement tonight. That pattern matters, not because this specific violation will trigger the restart, but because the pattern of violation followed by escalation, followed by a new ceasefire demand, is the operational rhythm of this conflict. And that rhythm, running against the backdrop of a closing military window, a depleted defensive inventory, and an unachieved strategic objective, produces an outcome that the ceasefire celebrations tonight are actively obscuring. The fireworks in Beirut are real. The hope they represent is real. And neither the fireworks nor the hope changes the military geometry that Israel is looking at when it counts what it has left and models what Iran will have when the ceasefire ends. Israel will restart this war. The only question the next 2 weeks will answer is whether it restarts it with American cover or without it. And I want to be precise about what without American cover means operationally, because the phrase gets used loosely in the punditry without anyone spelling out the military implications. The first round of this conflict was American and Israeli, nearly 900 strikes in the opening 12 hours of February 28th, B-2 stealth bombers, carrier strike groups, the full weight of the American military establishment operating alongside Israel. A second round without that American military weight is Israel operating its own air force, its own missiles, its own already depleted interceptors against an Iranian missile arsenal that has been restocking throughout this ceasefire. That is not the same war. That is a war Israel has never fought before against an Iran that has already demonstrated it can sustain 47 days of combat against the combined American-Israeli force. Iran against Israel alone is not a smaller version of the same calculation. It is a fundamentally different one. And whether Netanyahu's political survival requires him to accept that calculation is the question that will determine whether the fireworks in Beirut tonight mark the beginning of the end of this conflict or the intermission before its most dangerous act.